Now moving on to NPCs, we have Sarifa, who basically spends her entire time crapping on Vincent, which I does not seem like the typical relation. Definitely isn't the typical relationship between a maid and their because a maid would never talk about like the noble that they serve like that. But obviously, you get certain exceptions. Sarifa is one of those main exceptions, just constantly talking about like how most women end up rejecting him. Obviously, you get introduced to Patrick as well as others. People club searching. You meet Toa. You meet Colette, and her like addiction to shopping is a very big character trait for her. People finding clubs like Paula and Monica actually checked out the Fancy Club first, but they were like, no. You meet Fidelio from the photography club. Dorothy, like I brought up earlier, the literature. You meet Hannah, Harrison, and Hannah. They're actually the neighbors. It's like, yeah, like, they're like, oh, did you guys move in all the way? Like, this is after, like, this is your first free day. And they're like, oh, did you move in okay? Is everything all right? Like, if you ever need anything, neighbors, come over, like, you know, talk to us. And it's like, sure. And you meet their son, Kurt. I believe this is also, I definitely know I put a note for this later on, but I'll go ahead and throw it out there. I think it's interesting because I think Hannah and Harrison are the, Arden and Ellie. Is that his name? I'm trying to remember. Like the NPCs where you see their love story develop over the course of like this first two Sky games, because they eventually get married. I think their marriage doesn't happen until third, if I remember correctly, because I think it's one of the doors leads to their actual marriage. But obviously, timeline-wise, they do have a baby currently because you meet their dad in Azure. Yeah, definitely Azure. So Armin and Ellie, but it's like, yeah, Hannah and Harrison are like that, just because, like, you especially see it, like, it's a running gag, is that every time you're leaving for your field studies in the morning, you just happen to walk past them, and they're being, like, super adorable and cute and kissy and stuff like that, and they're like, oh no, we got caught by someone again, like, why do we always get caught in this, like, situation? And obviously Kurt's like, yeah, my mommy and daddy, like, love each other so much, they're so cute, like, you know, so I just think that's a very fascinating comparison, just essentially with them. So I love that. You meet Vivi. Literally, like, one of the first interactions you have with her, she's asking Reen to look at her underwear for her because she was in, like, the clothing store. And he was like, what? She's like, oh, I'm just joking. And she did it just to get his reaction. He's like, yep, that's all you need to know about Vivi right there. That, like, sums her up. You meet Kenneth and fishing. I don't remember if I included this in my notes, so I'll go ahead and talk about it here. If it's in my notes later on, I'll just skip over it then. But you meet Kenneth, who is one of the right, he's a Lake Lord. Not the first time gaming wise, if you play them in order, first time you run into a Lake Lord. But obviously, like, for Reen, it's like, he's not well versed in the Lake Lords, but it's like, oh wow, like, so he has a fishing rod kind of named after him and stuff like that. So it's like, yeah, his family's a pretty big deal. And obviously, like, you learn more and more as you run into Kenneth more and more. But man, he is the most laid back character. You will never find a character in this series more laid. I think, like, a lot of the fishermen and fishing people you meet over the course of these games tend to be, like, laid back. He is the most chillax dude you will ever meet. Like, you never, like, see any issues come up about Kenneth. Like NPC wise, like, his storylines are just always like, yeah, there's some stuff that comes up, but it's like he's always the most chilled and relaxed. Obviously, since I'm on the subject of fishing, like, this is something I was going to bring up, is the fishing minigame is so interesting, like how that shift and changed somewhat over the course of the games. I think the Sky games and the Azure games had that same thing of, like, you can have different rods, but you also have different baits. And they changed that for the Cold Steel games, and obviously they changed it even more for, like, 3 and 4, but it stays the same for 1 and 2. You can have different fishing rods, and I don't know what you, like, I guess you can, because I know you collect all the fish for a trophy, but because it's also connected to a quest too, which, you know, we'll get to that at some point, but because all that's, like, connected to a trophy, collecting all the fish. I don't know if you trade them in like you can, like, in this, because in this you get actual points. I don't know if you can do anything with the points. I think they're just for measurement sake in the other games. I could be 100% mistaken. I am talking from a place of ignorance in that regard, but when it, like, in this, it's like you don't have multiple baits like you did in previous games. You have one bait. And obviously it's interesting because you're limited to how much fishing you can do at one spot. So, like, for example, like, obviously in the original games, like, until you run out of bait, you can keep fishing in that same spot over and over again. You will run out of fish in a certain spot unless you re-up the bait. So basically, like, oh, you can fish at the place you most likely find Kenneth beside, like, God, what's that kid's name? It's Melissa and her husband. It was like Gordon and Annie, and I'm blanking on the son's name right now. I think it's going to be later on my list, but he's got an E in his name. Their house, that spot has like 5, you can fish there like 5 times. Same thing for the spot near the courtyard in the academy. But, like, once you use those up, you just use one ground bait and you're able to replenish it. I think you can only replenish it up to 3. Maybe it is always going to be the max 5 for those areas, because other areas, it's like only a minimum of, you can only fish like 3 times. But it's interesting how they changed that. But also the mechanic itself is different. Whereas, like, in the other games, it's like you fish, like, you just have to time it and hit it. This, there's a whole button mashing mini game to it, which people can feel, like, people feel the way they feel about the fishing. I don't mind it. Because the only reason why I still fish a lot of these times in these games is just because it's there, but also too, like, you can trade it in for prizes. You need some of those because there's items you can get early on that I'm also, like, because it's a new game plus, like, a lot of stuff is unlocked already, but there's at least sets of items you need to get early on in the game because you can exchange them later on for something. With spoilers, Colette, you need to get, like, sets of accessories, like, you need one of, because, like, there's like 3 pieces to every, like, accessory set, and you need, like, one of each, and there's like 3 different sets. Like, Colette will give you, I think it's Zemurian ore, if I'm not mistaken. Like, she gives you a piece for every set that you give her later on. Like, it's like in the finale of the game, the last chapter. So it's just something to kind of know later on. It's kind of spoilers, kind of giving you the ins and outs of that early on in this point, but once again, Emil, I just happened to catch his name later in my notes. It's the kid I was referencing, but just the interesting little thing about fishing. Speaking of that family, you know, Melissa and her husband don't get along because Gordon's always coming home and be like, yo, where's my bath, food, and sleep? She does everything, and, like, her husband does nothing. Yeah, he works, but it's just like their relationship is a back and forth. Every once in a while when you talk to him, you're getting updates to it. Annie, the youngest, she is obsessed. Well, not obsessed, but she's watching Kenneth, and from time to time you'll see her hanging around him. It's like, oh, hey, Kenny, what you doing? You know, it's super adorable. And then, because at this point she's like, oh, she's staring out the window, seeing what he's up to. She's like, I'm gonna talk to him next time. And you meet Emil, who's just kind of like the kid who studies a lot. You have Dorothy wanting Emma in the club. You have Stefan looking for a savior for the chess club. Your fencing club, you got Alan joining, Patrick, Friedel, the captain, Loggins. Obviously, you touch on the Bridget and Alan situation a little bit. We get our, like, introductions to that storyline, childhood friends and everything. Loggins and Patrick, I want to say it's like the next day or something, you learn they fought, but it ended up in a draw, and, like, Loggins is pissed because he didn't go full throttle like he should have, and Patrick is the pompous douchebag that he is. So it's like, oh, like, this tough guy who's a second year, well, I went toe-to-toe with him. We came out even, but it's like, for Loggins, it's like, no, I should have smashed that little smug punk into the dirt, so it pisses him off. Because now Patrick's all high and mighty, like, oh, like, he's supposed to be a second year, and I'm a first year, and I even the playing field. You learn about Vincent and Ferris being siblings. Theresia and Emily, who are the heads of the lacrosse club, talk about being like Elisa and Ferris, first year wise, being coached, and now they're the coaches. You meet Rosine, who's helping at the church, Becky, who's working at the bookstore. All of them had to kind of get permission from Thomas, which I think is interesting. I wonder why him specifically, like, for that. Why specifically him? Regardless. I have some thoughts in some areas, but, like, for the Rosine thing, I was like, I have thoughts about that, but like the Becky one, I'm like, why? Like maybe it's just one of the classes he teaches would allow for that, or maybe he'd be the most okay with it. Like maybe every other teacher there might be in it. I don't know. I mean, Instructor Mary seems like she'd be pretty like okay with that. Makarov just like, as long as it's less work for him to be worried about, he's fine with it. Speaking of, I might have had this later in my notes. Once again, if it's there, I'm going to not talk about it later. It is actually interesting because there are items specifically tied to like certain teachers. It's Marikov, Mary, and Beatrix. Basically, you do certain things in the games, they will give you different, like having filled out the notebook. I want to say Mary gives you something for filling out the notebook. Makarov gives you something for filling out your battle book of just like information on enemies, and Beatrix gives you something for completing quests. Makarov and Instructor Mary, you can like if you like carrying over stuff from previous playthroughs, the first time you talk to them like at the end of like your afternoon class, like at the beginning of the game, like in this chapter, like before you go skip to your free day the next day, like after returning to the dormitory, like if you talk to them that first day, they will talk to you like, oh, Reen, blah 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 blah, and they will give you those medals. It's just an interesting little detail of like you can get those immediately, with the exception of Beatrix, because side quest stuff does not carry over. No matter how many times you play the game, like no matter what you carry over notebook wise, you can't carry over the quest. Those are like from scratch every time you play the game, even with a new game plus. So Beatrix is the only one you can't get from the very beginning, along with another one, because there's a fourth one you can get from Van Dyke by getting all three. So you have to wait a little while. You have to bait because, you know, I don't remember what the exact number is. It's a certain amount of like quests you have to complete. It's a pretty big chunk into the game before like Beatrix will give it to you until you're in a position to get all these. Like for Beatrix, you would basically have to make sure you're doing every quest, hidden, main, optional, you know, all across the board. I was like. I was about to say, I don't, it had to be like probably post chapter 5, I'd assume. I don't know if it's like chapter 7 or, I feel like it's a little beforehand. I don't remember. But like I said, I just think that's such an interesting little detail that you could get those so early like that. Like I said, it's like you talk to them, they had the conversation like, oh, Reen, look at all the great stuff you've done. And then immediately the next dialogue box is like, oh, you're a new student, huh? It's just the inconsistency is just funny. Like it's just a funny little New Game Plus detail. Obviously you meet the vice principal, who doesn't like Sara at all because he hates how super lazy she is. I don't think you ever really find out what his, like, he's obviously nobility, and I guess I never really thought about it before, but it's like, right, he's so snobbish like a noble, it makes sense, but I don't think you ever find out, like, whether he's from, like, a well-off known, like, family or not, like, what his family circumstances are, I don't know. You meet Lind, which I would always call her Linde, but because there's a ship, once again, like names that carry over, there's a ship in Liberl called the Lind. I heard someone, Kill Scott Kill, he's a YouTuber, he's a pretty big Kiseki fan, he's actually part of the Geofront people who, like, group who translated Zero and Azure, but he pronounced it Lind, and I was like, oh, is that actually how you pronounce that? Like, I didn't know it was like a silent E out, so anytime I would say her name, I would say Linde instead of like Lind. So I'm trying that out for now. So you have her teaching Gaius instead of Clara because Clara's too busy. It's like, no, I've got my own stuff to work on. She's like, you think Sarah's hands off? Clara is on a whole other level of hands off of just like, yeah. You have Nicholas and Margarita, the cooking club. She's wanting to cook a special blend. You meet George. One of your first requests has you like delivering stuff for him because people send stuff to George for them to fix. Mitch, who runs the pawn shop, gives you a blade deck. Didn't want it. Mentions a second year who he got it from. I had something else in my notes, but I was like, what was that? Because my notes are terrible because like I just have a whole bunch of spelling errors. It's like 2 characters mention a second year First one, I think I was referencing like the librarian, referencing like a second year who's terrible at bringing their books back. Certain very, very carefree second year we get to know a lot about more later on. You have Lotte, or maybe it's just Lot. I once again, the freaking silent E's, I don't know. She's the maid that works out front of the she works in the upper class dormitories, the noble dormitories, but more often than not, 9 out of 10 times you'll find her outside. I think there's only like one time in the game you'll actually find her inside the dormitories, and that's at like a later point in the game. Might even be where I am. I think it was like chapter 3 or 4 or something like that. But she's expanding her cooking knowledge for noble students. She wants to share like a greater variety at the dorms, because the nobles typically don't cook their own foods. Like the commoners typically will in some cases, but the nobility have like their maids and servants, butlers and maids end up cooking for them. Lot, you end up, this is something for her and Thomas. If you had if you're carrying over stuff and you've already cooked it all, I don't really know how the cooking works in the previous games. I've seen bits and pieces as I've seen people play them, but like, obviously I only know really how it works in the Cold Steel games, specifically Cold Steel 1 and 2. I think it's different in 2, but in 1, every time you cook something, Reen cooks it along with them, unless it's like, oh, Reen's cooking this alone. It changes in later games. I want to say 2 does it different too. Like, I think 2-1 is when it changes, but regardless, obviously if it's a new game plus like mine, you already have all the recipes, so you can cook stuff, but the problem is you can't cook stuff when people aren't in your party. They have to literally be in your party to cook. Now that's definitely something that's modified, I know, in 3 and 4, where like you can cook even if those people aren't in your party. They don't even have to be with you. If you've unlocked those characters in the grand scheme of things, they can cook anywhere at any point in time. So, but obviously in this one, you have to form a party with said characters to cook for it to count. Like, you can't cook with anyone that's not in your party. Like I said, I think that's a 3 and 4 thing. I think that's not even a 2 thing. I think you still need to have them in your party, but I think Reen cooking with them only happens in 1. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because you have to give Latte or Lote, you have to give her all your superb dishes, I want to say. I always confuse superb and unique. And you have to give Thomas your terrible dishes. And so this is one of those things, like, you can immediately get these done. You get special quartz, good quartz for it. I don't even remember what the rewards are, like what those said quartz are. But that's the only reason why to do it. There's no, like, side quest correlation to it. I'm trying to remember, do you give... I think that's this game. There's a side quest related to like getting some really good recipe items that you make and giving them to somebody. I'll talk about it when the quest comes up, but that's like super late game. That might be like second to last chapter maybe, or maybe even the last chapter. I don't remember, because I keep trying to think. I was like, is that the second game or is that the first game? I was like, I'm pretty sure that's the first game. This game, but it's one of those things that, like I said, like, you carry it over, you can immediately knock this quest out, but you would have had to cook enough of each of these dishes, like, prior because like I said, you have to wait till you unlock, because at this point in time you only have access to Elliot and Gaius at this point in the story, like when I'm referencing all of this, so you can't like make those recipes whenever you want to, and even later you only have access to Elliot, Elisa, and Laura. But because I'm carrying on, because I always make sure to cook a whole bunch of extra dishes so that when the time comes, like, I'm screwed over in 4 because I ran out of ingredients just because of circumstances. I won't get into it too much, but like, I don't have a lot of stuff I can carry over in 4. Every other game, 1, 2, and 3, I have enough like stuff made so I can, like, when I carry it over, I can immediately knock those type of those out immediately, of like, oh, like, hand me these certain dishes, or whether it's the good dishes or the terrible dishes. Just kind of an interesting thing. I figured I'd go ahead and reference that with her character here, since I'm bringing her up. You have Celestine and Sarifa. Sorry. Obviously, I referenced Sarifa earlier, but these servants for big households. Sarifa obviously serving Ferris and Vincent's household, the Floralds. And Celestine as the one who serves Patrick. I think at this point you only know about him just like, oh, I serve Patrick. I think that's all Celestine says. He just wants you to get along with the upper class, but looks up to them because they represent such big households. I guess she just represents, because there is a tier to like the nobles. It doesn't get brought up too much, but like at the bottom of it are barons. That's actually what Reen's dad is. So like his dad's a noble, but it's never like a big thing, because you have your barons, your viscounts, and I think the highest level are your counts, and then you have like your dukes. Like the dukes, there's only 4 of them. There can only ever be 4 representing the 4 houses. But like below that would be like counts. So counts are like amongst typical nobility, with the exception of the dukes. The counts are typically the highest rank, and I think it goes viscount, and then barons are at the bottom of the list of like, they're still nobles, but they're not the most powerful of the nobles. So just interesting little things. You get introduced to Michael. Talks about his future programming tonight. This is before like you later on get introduced to Aben time, because this is when you got the Orbal radio from helping George with that quest. But Michael, like, you know, he's the one who runs Radio Trista, and obviously wants you to listen to like the new program, which you later on get introduced to Misty and Aben time. So Mint and Makarov, niece, sent by Mint's his niece. She was sent by his sister to the academy to check on him. You learn that she's basically Zoro from One Piece. She has a terrible sense of direction. You meet Beryl, knows about encounter with Elisa. And I love that Reen immediately is like, oh, must be that the rumors are spreading. Like, no one else references it other than Beryl, because you quickly learn that Beryl's a weirdo who just knows stuff that she shouldn't know. So, but I love that was the immediate thing of just like, yeah. I do have it in my notes, so I guess at some point it gets referenced to Lake Lords. Lake Lord the Third. I guess at one point when you're talking to Kenneth, he references his brother, which obviously the events of Azure haven't happened yet, but that is where, which is the previous game to this, Azure is where you get introduced to Lake Lord III. And man, I was surprised, like, he's kind of a dick when you do meet him again, but I wasn't expecting him to be, like, such a D-bag. But it's like, right, when you consider, like, what nobility is like in Erebonia, that kind of comes as no surprise. And considering, like, yeah, because I was about to say, yeah, they are nobles and everything, so. I was about to say, they're not even nobles, like, yeah, they actually are nobles, so. You learn an interesting detail. I think this is one of those profile things about Nicholas, is that one bite and he can tell what's in something ingredients-wise, which is pretty important, I guess. You know, it just shows you, like, how top-class Nicholas is, and it's very befitting for him to be in the, the head of the, cooking class. They don't ever talk about it, but there are other people there, but it's only, like, the main NPCs you get to see, because obviously, like, you see, like, other people. This might be later on. I was about to say, you do see characters taking, like, the this is definitely a chapter 2 thing where you see, like, students taking cooking classes and stuff like that, but this is mainly like this is mainly like the club. But, like, because there's not enough, like, random NPCs running around. You meet some like female student or random second class student, whatever, second year student, stuff like that. But, like, you don't see a lot of NPCs in places like that. But it's like, I guess it's supposed to be, like, understood, like, yeah, there are, like, main named NPCs that go to these clubs. Like, Margarita, like I mentioned before, is part of the cooking club. But there's other people, too. But, like, those are just random NPCs that they just don't bother modeling being there, because that's just a lot of work that you don't have to necessarily go through. So, just interesting. You have Mick again. In my notes, I'm referencing he warns about people in Celdic being territorial, the spiders you meet. Now, in the grand scheme of things, the context of, like, right, the provisional army, now you kind of get what he was referencing. He always lets slip some information like that of, like, yeah, you might want to keep note of what he says, because it's usually kind of a forewarning sign in some regards to, like, what you might encounter. You actually run into Annabelle in the Celdic, because you end up helping her find. No, she's not. I was about to say, like, is she in Trista first? It's like, no, I think it is, like, meeting her. I think I'm referencing her in Celdic. She is one of those NPCs. I love the progression of her story. She's just one of those NPCs that's like, oh, like, she's just missing her wallet, but then like that story takes on some interesting directions as you progress. You know, we'll talk about it more and more, but Annabelle is definitely one of my favorite NPCs where her story has gone. There's a merchant in Celdic named Gibson. Well, there's like Morais, who is like a NPC who's just spending most of her time, like every time you're meeting her, she's typically just sitting at the inn eating. That's kind of like one of her staples. But there was also a merchant named Gibson. He talked about the anniversary festival in Crossbell and was there, and I was like, I wonder, is he actually an NPC? Like, if you go, I didn't pay as much attention to the, like, I paid some attention to some of, like, when I was watching someone play, because the person I was watching play talked to like every NPC, as they call it. Shout out to the Twit Gamer. He calls it the rounds, where he just talks to the NPCs at different points in time to see if there's dialogue changed. I don't remember if Gibson's one of those NPCs you can talk to at that point in time, but maybe he is. Do let me know in the comments down below. Another set of NPCs I liked that we get to follow around is Baron Poe and his daughter Clarice. She's buying a fabric that costs like 300,000 at the Grand Market. Yeah, what was it? I think I said something about the Grand Market being closed and didn't need to buy now. Saved money. I don't know what that was in reference to. I was like, I wonder, is that in reference to, like, because I think the fabric she was trying to buy is somewhere from the east, so it could have been, like, even more expensive. So, like, buying it now before the it closed, that I don't remember the context of, like, what, once again, me and my shoddy notes. I don't remember what the context of that was. Like I said, I think it's just like, oh, I better buy it now while I have the opportunity, something of that nature. Yeah, NPCs to keep an eye out for. You meet Lyman, main dude in Celdic. He's also Becky's dad. He'll help out a lot in the Grand Market. He's also the dude you get the request from, where like the next day, like, or in the afternoon at one point in time, where Reen, Elliot, Laura, and Elisa can sell different items and get a good understanding of running the shop. Obviously, Reen's how good Reen does depends on you, but obviously, like, your performance will be affected by, like, AP, but like, if you do all the right stuff, it's like, oh, Reen, you're pretty good at it. Obviously, regardless of anything, Elisa will always do the best. She just has a mindset for business. I wonder why. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You have Squero and Maurice, merchants. She made some deal that went super sideways, because I forgot, like, what she was investing in, like, went like pear-shaped, and he cuts her some slack. Things went sideways with Rye. That's what it was specifically. But he thinks she has what it takes to be a good merchant, so he's like, yeah, he's going to be keeping an eye out for her. You have, like, York and Linz. They have these whole, like, conversations, because Linz is trying to learn from York, but he's, like, keeps pushing him with, like, wild advice. Part of being a merchant is being about strong and independent. So he was pushing York to the point, like, I forgot who's, I want to say Linz is the amateur learning from the older merchant York. And it was like, yeah, the whole point was like, yeah, I'm going to keep pushing you more and more, because I want you to be able to stand up for yourself, because being a merchant's about being strong and independent. So you have to, like, not just follow someone else's advice. Sometimes you got to trust yourself in this. So just some extra NPC stuff I have taken notes. Like I said, I'm a little more in-depth about this in the future chapters. Like I said, just a lot of this is a little all over the place, so I apologize again. And now I'm moving on to our In Erebonia / Zemuria lore section. So first thing I have on my notes was like the Orbal Revolution, because I think this game goes a little deeper into it than any other game. Like, I think it gets talked. I feel like I don't really remember it being talked about much at all in the Crossbell games, like here and there, but I feel like you get a much deeper dive into this. I feel like with the sake of, like, you are in a learning position, so, like, I'd assume with that consideration, I'd assume, like, it probably comes up earlier in the Sky games, but I feel like because you're in an educational system, like, that is something that kind of gets drilled home a lot more throughout, especially this game. Because I guess this game is, like, for a lot of people, this was a starting off point, and I guess that's the point of every arc, to kind of be a starting off point, so that it helps. Oh, if you have played the previous games, you know what's what, but here's kind of like a refresher for those who maybe it's been a while and forgotten, or for those who just don't know it all. So like I said, I just feel like the Orbal Revolution stuff, it gets referenced in the Crossbell games, but I feel like I don't remember it being a bigger thing, but they dive a lot deeper into it, just what that means in the grand scheme of like transportation, which that's an interesting conversation when you compare just the 3 countries so far of like the comparisons between, not even the countries you've been to, because like Crossbell like bounces between the two, because Liberl's main thing is airships. That was like the main mode of transportation, like how people get from like across the different regions, obviously like as bracers, and obviously it being a key point of their training. Estelle and them walk everywhere, obviously, but you know, airships exist for that purpose. But here in Erebonia, that's why the train tracks are such a large system, because Erebonia's main form of transportation is trains. There are airships, but like what airships are to Liberl is what trains are for Erebonia. So that's the main mode of transportation. There are cars, because you don't really see cars at all in Liberl. I don't think so, because they are a bigger thing in Calvard. Calvard's like a big automobile like place. Because they talk about it. I think it comes up. I'm trying to remember which one that comes up. That doesn't come up yet, so I won't reference it. It's in reference to a book, but the book doesn't come up until a later game, so I won't reference it there. But I guess since it's in my notes, it must came up at some point about like Calvert being mainly automobiles. But the reason why I was bringing it up is because we know Crossbell is a combination of all of that, because Crossbell does utilize airships because it has air travel to go to other places. It does have the train system like Erebonia, but it also has automobiles like Calvert. So to be fair, like Crossbell has always been that. Like it has a cross section between so many other countries because it is like the epicenter. It is essentially Zemuria's like number one like commerce like central. And so, I mean, it's the city itself is meant to be like a reflection of both like the West and the East. So that makes sense because Calvert is in the East, because a lot of the Eastern culture resides in Calvert. But obviously there's lands even further east that you hear about reference with Calvert, but you just always hear it being like, oh, in the East. That's just usually how that gets brought up. But I think that's interesting. Speaking of Liberl, I think this is probably one of the books in the libraries, because I have something like a book reference of like the Burrow incident, the Orbal Shutdown, which I think was kind of interesting. Obviously, like no one outside of like the main crew will ever know like the ins and outs of it, because I think even that book I read, like I said, I'm pretty sure it's in the library. Like, it doesn't go into the ins and outs because, like, they're the only ones who know the actual details of, like, Ouroboros was behind it, this and that. Like, obviously, they would only, like, everyone generally knows, like, the surface level details about it. I don't remember if it's this. It might be later on that comes up about, like, oh, like I said, this is Liberl, so we can the Sky game stuff, so it's kind of more on limits without, like, really being too much in spoiler territory, but, obviously, like, we know the Erebonia side of that just because, like, the army showed up, and obviously everything Olivert, or Olivier as he was at the time, was up to, like, keeping an eye on everything in Liberl and, you know, stopping things from escalating too much further when, like, Erebonia wanted to encroach on Liberl around that time, so. It is something that's already brought up, like, I have to wait till later to this game. I don't think the 100-day war is brought up at all. It might. I actually don't remember if that gets referenced at all, like, during any of your classes. I mean, to be fair, it's not, like, one of Erebonia's, like, proudest moments. So they don't talk about it, but obviously, like, the 100-day war is pertinent in many different regards when, you know, learning about Joshua's connection to it, even like Estelle's connection to it, like her mom died during that, but also like what that meant for Joshua and his situation, like, you know, the whole Hummel thing, you know. I definitely know where that goes in later parts of the Trails game, Code Steel games, but I just don't remember if that's something that ever gets brought up this game. So since I'm already on the subject, and once again, Sky game related, I'm just going ahead and talking about it now since it's on my mind. There was an interesting conversation about the Highlands, I think, kind of got brought up, and maybe specifically them being contested. I don't know if it comes up. It probably does, I know it comes up later on, but I don't know if it comes up this early about where the Highlands kind of are positioned. Like, it's not just Erebonia, it's Calvert. So, like, the same conversations that I had about Crossbell, because even during that, like, I want to say it was Oliver, makes a reference to, like, oh, Crossbell circumstances, like, Nord Highlands got reference in being in that same lane of, like, being contested territory, like, Crossbell is. So, it's interesting that these two large places, very distinct, different places, but you have, like, the metropolis that is Crossbell, the country as a whole, but, like, just, especially, like, Crossbell City, and compare that to, like, the vast Nordic lands of Nord, where, like, the nomads live, just, like, both those lands being contested by the same two countries. It's just interesting. I mean, obviously we get our lore dumps about the Drykel and the War of Lions. Obviously, this would be something that would never come up in the other games, because, like, outside perspectives on Erebonia. I think I talked about that in the prologue, maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I'll talk about it a little bit more here, but, like, the whole aspect of that, it is interesting. Yeah, I definitely did talk about it, like, how I have a soft spot for Erebonia because, like, I started with the Cold Steel games, but if you start with the other games, you're like, oh, Erebonia kind of sucks. So it's interesting. It kind of ties into, like, learning more about Erebonia, because, like, no other game would teach you about Erebonia. So, but it also could be, like, Falcon being like, we've decided to come up with some backstory to it. Like, when you look at some of the stuff they already introduced, like, in other games, you're like, wow, they were thinking about this, like, that far in advance. Like, even some of the stuff they reference in, like, the Cold Steel games, I mean, the Crossbow games, you're like, oh, man, they had this planned out. They had some smaller ideas about where they wanted to go. I mean, but they've been planting the seeds forever. I mean, Oliver was part of the original crew, and not OG crew, but still, like, he's part of the team, the Liberl squad. So, like, yeah, like, and introducing him as, like, secretly being an Erebonian. Yeah, like, they've been planting the seeds for, like, when they eventually got to Erebonia for a while. So, but learning about Drykels and the War of the Lions and what that meant, knowing that, like, Erebonia went through, like, I don't know if they went to the specifics of using the term Civil War at this point in time. I think they brought up Drykels being the prince that, like, had to come and, like, take the throne back, essentially, because he was, like, the fourth prince, if I remember correctly. So he was kind of in Nord at the time, because Nord Highlands is actually where he got his army before he came to the capital, Heimdall, and, the War of the Lions happened. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, to an extent, like, previously, it might have been in a prologue, where, like, the different Orbments, which I think is interesting, because, like, Class 7 is using the Arcus, which is they're the only ones that really have it, because it's a prototype. But then I'm curious about, like, what other Orbments do, like, other characters use? Because, like, we have, like, in Crossbell and even in Liberl, it's, like, the Enigma, but, like, like, main character, like, because I think the Enigma's enough widespread, like, so, like, everyone that has an Orbment, battle Orbment in those games, like Liberl or the Crossbell games, every other character and every person you're meeting that's using arts and stuff like that is using an Enigma. But the thing is, the Arcus unit it makes me wonder, like, what about the other students at the school? Are they using, like, are they using Orbment? Like, what Orbments are they using? Are they using something like the Enigma? Are they using, because they never talk about, like, the generic Orbment in Erebonia, so I'm assuming it's just got to be them using, like, what is widespread at the time, the Enigma, because that is made by the Epstein Foundation, and it's like that's the only, like, more regular one. Obviously the Arcus has very specific capabilities, we've talked about that before, but it's just because that's a combination of the Epstein and Reinford Foundation working together on that. It's a dual project for them, but that never gets answered, just like what kind of Orbments they can use. So I'm only assuming that has to deal with that. Like, that it has to have something to do with just the Enigmas. That's what everyone else uses. Obviously, I brought it up before, just how interesting it is that you're doing requests for people, just, first being a bracer, then being a cop, and now you're being a student helping people. So I also noticed this little detail, and I'm gonna skate around this just for the sake of like non-spoilers for future things, just because like I know it's stupid, but like I want these just to be their own sections of like, yeah, let's spoiler talk these respective chapters that I'm talking about. Sara, if you go in her room, which you can go, there is a map, and she has like circles and like I think check marks and X's, and I'm like, at first I was wondering if that has anything to do with the, because it's a static image, it doesn't change. At least I don't think it does. But I don't think there's like multiple images. It's just a static map that they just keep the same. But those, like, first I was like, are they related to field studies? Is what I'm wondering about. Or she's like picking locations. But then something else crossed my mind. Considering Sara's circumstances, which obviously we'll learn about later on in the game of like who she was before she became an instructor, I'm wondering, is that map in correlation to connections to stuff that was happening in Erebonia during everything that was going down during Liberl, the type of stuff that pulled Cassius away. I'm curious, is anything correlated, like is that what that map's correlated to? Maybe not. It might just be the field study stuff, but I never paid the map attention. I was like, oh, it's interesting, like she's got like, cause it's like a lower res image, so you can't really tell, and not everything is labeled 100%, so you don't, I mean, maybe if I took another look, I might be able to make more sense of it, but those are the two possibilities I'm throwing out there, that it is connected to the field study, she's trying to pick locations, which there is a bonding event, I believe, later on, where she talks a little bit more about how she goes about that. We'll get to that then, or whether it's this thing that's connected to, like, why Cassius had to come to Erebonia in the first place during, the Sky games, well, specifically the first Sky game. So I'm curious to ultimately see. I just thought that was such a fascinating little detail. Obviously, we're hearing a little bit more about just like the world of Erebonia. There's like the budget press conference, plans to like expand the military, which obviously that lends itself more towards Osborne, because I think there's already, because it's a statement from him, because Calvert had already strengthened there, so it's only like right that they do it. Like it's always Erebonia and Calvert go back and forth like cats and dogs, and just like, oh, you're doing something, well, we're going to do it too. And Osborne, knowing what we know about him from the past, he is someone that's not afraid to like strong arm a situation, that he's ready to, and once again, it kind of lends itself more to like, man, Erebonia is always ready for a fight, always ready for a war. Some reps have are hesitant, but you have like Carl Regnitz, Machias' dad, which we learned a little bit more about like who his dad was, because Eustace kind of dropped the bomb in the prologue, but his dad is someone who does approve it. There's the Transportation Act being a lot of the four, I think of that great houses. The four great houses, or maybe it's just nobles in general, that were kind of commenting on like driving used to be just a noble privilege, and that's not something you've ever seen, like even in Crossbell. Like if you have enough money, you can get a car. Like you don't have to be like, yeah. But whereas like in Erebonia, it used to be kind of more like seen as a prestigious thing. But if you let commoners do it, because the whole point is like to put commoners on the like equal scaling with nobles, but the nobles feel like that makes a little sense. It's interesting too, because this Transportation Act, it's happening kind of around the same time in Crossbell, because they had to start enacting those type of laws too. Like you actually see the progression of the story of being like, oh yeah, like there's certain things they couldn't do traffic wise because those laws weren't in place, but now at later points in the Crossbell arc, there are things that the SSS or just police in general can do, because now there are like car laws in place. Like, because Crossbell's laws are all over the place because they're in that complicated territory of like, right, they're smack dab in the middle of other people's laws, and like laws don't apply to like Erebonian or Calvardian citizens, so they're in like that ends up being the whole thing that it is in the Crossbell arc. So I made reference to this earlier about Celdic being kind of similar to Bose and Crossbell City, because it's kind of like that market hub. Obviously, it leans more towards Bose, but Crossbell City kind of plays that role too. And I think that's so interesting, because like the country of Crossbow pertains like all the towns and stuff like that. Obviously, like St. Ursula Hospital, like everything outside of Crossbell City still falls under like I always say like Mind's Mind, but I think it's like I think, no, I always think Maine's mines, but it's mines. Like the mountains where like they get septium from in a Crossbell. That, God, what was the other town? Armorica Village, for example. So like a lot of that's all still Crossbell country, like the country, but I guess because in my head it's just because it's like Crossbell City is like the central capital city, but it's like it's also like the only city in Crossbell, you know. So it's like, because like at least in Erebonia, like you go to somewhere like a small town like Trista, and obviously there's like Heimdall, and then there's Celtic, just for the perspective of just comparing like Celtic to Trista, like how Celtic has that more rural feel to it, whereas Trista kind of has more of a, I guess, suburban feel, I guess would be the more appropriate terminology, maybe. I don't know, I think that's such the interesting little difference between them and stuff like that. I referenced him earlier, but like the Imperial Fishing Club, because I referenced Kenneth's brother, Lake Lord III. I think Kenneth talks about them a little bit more later on, so I'll probably save it there, but there is talks about the Imperial Fishing Club. I think it might be here, or maybe it's later. I'll probably talk about it more then, but I think Kenneth does bring up his brother starting the Imperial Fishing Club, maybe, but, or it might be referencing that's what the club itself is too. Now that's a club I actually feel like Kenneth might be the only one, because he's the only one that's a nut job about it. Like if she was a little bit older, I'm sure he would be able to convince Annie to join it. And I like to think, honestly, if she ever gets older and goes to Thors, because school is like right there across from Trista, like, you know, the main bridge and everything. I'd like to think like she probably would join the fishing club, just because like she got buddied with Kenneth and stuff like that. So obviously, there's talks, we get early inklings of the higher ranking people when it comes to making decisions at the school. Like, scholarship decisions are made by a group of important people. I think this is like a line of dialogue from like I don't know if it's the person who, I'm always blanking on her name. It's Karen and Bianca, if I remember correctly. Bianca's the NPC who's at the front of, like, when you first get into the main building of Thors, like the NPC that's at the receptionist desk. I think it's Bianca, because her brother is one of the NPCs in town. But I want to say, was it Karen is the librarian? I think definitely Bianca is the receptionist. I want to say the librarian's name is Karen, but I think Bianca's the one that has this line of dialogue. Another interesting thing about this game is the introduction of Sepeith Mass, because this gives you another lane to make money in a game. Because in the previous games, the only times you would make money is by selling if you make money from like a quest or something like that, which I think the Bracers actually did get paid, so you had that outlet for money. You didn't get a lot, but I think you still got paid. But like, did you get paid in like septium? Like, that's what you find in chests. Like, that's your main means of making money, is selling septium. You obviously you need it, so like you always have to be careful not to sell too much. But if you ever need money, that was like your only other means of like, but you know, so it was kind of a double-edged sort of like, yeah, selling this material needed. So for these games, Falcom, I guess, changed that a little bit so that people would have a little bit more spending money. So they created this thing, Sepeith Mass. But I like that there is an in-world thing for it too. This is like a impurity from Sepeith, but recently they learned how to get it from Sepeith. So most places will take it off your hands now. So it's not just like an Erebonia thing, it's an everywhere thing now. But it's just like, as technology has advanced, they've just somehow found this out, which is interesting considering, I guess, like, maybe it started in Erebonia, but now it's going to branch out, because like it's still not, it wasn't a thing in the Crossbell games, but that's because Falcom hadn't designed that yet. So, but still, it's just because obviously this happens at the same time as the Crossbell games. So I just think that's fascinating. I mean, it helps in the long run, and out of anything, it is worth the most. Like, for every piece of Sepeith, it's 10 mirror, whereas like everything else is like a smaller range. It's like maybe 3 or 4, but like it is straight up 10 mirror for every Sepeith. So like it makes money be able to stack up pretty quickly. So obviously I brought it up before about the gargoyle that obviously you get sent to investigate the Old Schoolhouse, but I think it's Van Dyke references the gargoyle as being something of like a fiend or demon, and I think that's so interesting. Getting this so early, because like the fiends and demons territory tends to happen later in the game, so that for that to kind of be something thrown at like that terminology. But then it's like, once again, these games are kind of built upon each other of like, yeah, let's kind of, a lot of concepts that come up later in some of the older games will come up a little sooner in this arc, just because they're like, right, like if you play the other games, it was like, let's introduce you to this concept that was kind of already introduced in something else. Let's get to it a little earlier rather than waiting till super later. There'll be other instances of that going on. I also, I brought it up earlier too, like if the statue is left alone long enough, it will automatically regenerate. It is interesting. They say like the Old Schoolhouse has changed in the past year. Without going into it, I feel like I have some theories about that. Because that terminology, like the past year, meaning it seems like the year before the events of this game, it already started shifting. And I am, like I said, I have my theories about what might have correlated that. If I remember to bring this up conversation-wise later, maybe. I think a certain person's appearance affected that. Someone who has connections to the Schoolhouse storyline wise, like if you know later Cold Steel games, you know what I'm talking about. I think that person's appearance, because like I said, the specific, like the past year they've changed, so that means, because I would assume like if they were saying like, oh, this year, yeah, other things have happened too, but the Schoolhouse had changes in the past year, but this year is when it's had the most drastic changes of like the developments. Obviously we see more and more every time you explore this Old Schoolhouse, but I think that's interesting. Big thing, I was talking about this earlier, that is the 8 Leaves. I referenced Reen Schwarzer being an 8 Leaves practitioner, which I actually have done a video recently, a move list video where I just like talked about the 8 Leaves, specifically Reen's techniques, because I love Reen's techniques the most, because out of any of the 8 Leavers, he's the one I've had the most experience with, because I've seen someone play the Liberl game, but that's about my extent with them, and I've seen a little bit of Arios' moveset, so that's about it. But Reen's the one you spend the most time with, and that's what I think is such a fascinating thing, because it is interesting, like, you go from game to game, and this is your first game with an 8 Leaves main protagonist. It's not just like, oh, one of your protagonists is an 8 Leaves practitioner. It's like, no, your main character that you play through is the 8 Leaves practitioner. So, like, obviously there was the tangential connection, not tangential, but directly yet indirect connection between Estelle and Joshua. You know, their dad, Cassius, being a Divine Blade, being an 8 Leaver. Granted, he left behind the path of the sword and now took up the staff, but a lot of his training still led to him becoming the beast that he is. Like, being able to go from a sword to like a staff and still be able to master it just shows his mastery and understanding of all things, which is part of the 8 Leaves like pathway. He's going the way like no other 8, like that puts Cassius in a whole other category, because he's going down a lane like, to our knowledge, no other like 8 Leaver has. Because at this point in the story, we are aware of 5 8 Leavers. There's Cassius, well, technically 6. We have their master, Yun Kafai. Then you have Cassius, who's kind of in that former territory, but then you have Alan, who's a practitioner, you have Annalise, who's a practitioner, and then you have Arios, and now you have Reen. But like I said, it's always been like someone else. Like you eventually have Annalise in your party for a little bit in 2. She becomes like a main character in 3. The 8 Leaves gets talked about a little bit in first and second chapter, but third chapter is where it gets a little deeper of a dive. And I'm wondering, is that where they started having the idea if they wanted someone who's an 8 Leaver to be the main protagonist? I wonder like how far in advance did like Falcom think about that, because Annalise has a door in Sky the Third where she like goes up against Cassius and Alan, because I don't know if they ever talk about what. Because an interesting thing, like, I didn't realize, because I guess this is a line of dialogue somewhere, and I don't remember it come up in the Cold Steel games or the older ones, but basically when it comes to the 8 Leaves, there are 8 forms. You have to, like, be pretty good, like a jack of all trades with all the forms, but to become a Divine Blade, you need to master one particular form. You have to be good at all of them, but you have to master at least one. So in Cassius's case, he mastered the first form, Helix, and then you have Arios, who mastered the second form, Gale. we're on, even at this point in time, not unless something's come up in Hajimari, which is like the kind of almost third, like it's the Cold Steel equivalency to Sky to third. It's kind of like, it's combination of like, it fills that role for both the Crossbell games and the Erebonia games. Regardless, unless something comes up in that, we're still unclear where Annalise is. I don't remember if they ever talked about what form she uses the most. Because I know Richard, for example, tends to use the fifth form the most. It's like a more like, I think defensive form, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong. Like, I'm still ignorant on some of the, like, because there were some things when I was doing the video, I was like, oh, I was kind of incorrect on certain aspects and avenues when it came to my understanding of the 8 leaves. But I also think it's interesting too, because I've, without spoiling things, there are like 2 Divine Blades that we're aware of at this point in time. Cassius and Arios. Arios is the only one that has a subtitle to his Divine Bladeness. He is the Divine Blade of Wind. Cassius is just a Divine Blade, making the 8 leaves like the main focus, and just not only just reading story as just a regular swordsman or just as a student, and just figure out his personal stuff, like how that's all tied into the 8 leaves as well for him. I think that's so interesting. There's the Old Schoolhouse existing, back in the Dark Age period, after the Great Collapse, which that, I feel like that definitely comes up the most in this game, because this game these games, the Cold Steel ones in particular, circle around the Great Collapse a little bit more than anything else. It gets brought up here and there in, like, I think the Liberl stuff. I feel like I don't remember it being as pertinent as a thing as I know it is going to be in this. Like, the Dark Ages get brought up a lot, the Middle Ages, the Great Collapse, like a lot of that gets brought up a lot during this arc. So this is where it's like the most pertinent kind of, it's Zemuria lore in general, but it definitely leans more towards this game. They also reference like there being like alchemy, which I think is interesting. Like with the Crossbell games, we know that alchemy existed and stuff like that. So it's interesting to know like where it existed in Zemuria in general, but obviously it makes sense it would translate over to probably other countries like Erebonia. Like, I don't know, like alchemy's something that comes up, but it never gets talked about a lot. That's mainly a Crossbell thing where they really lean into alchemy, because Erebonia has its other like its own lores and fairy tale like type of lore. So you have Samantha and Ramsey who work in a cafeteria. They did reference they worked in a noble's home. I don't think it ever comes up who. It might just be like some nameless noble. But I was like, if you know in the comments down below if it's someone of significance, like do hit me up. If it's a spoiler, like put like spoiler or something. But like I legitimately don't remember if it's ever revealed to be someone significant. It might just be some generic like, yeah, we worked in a home. So I don't know if that's something that does come up later, if who that might be, or maybe it's not. We also learned that the royal family attends Thors. One of the previous princes attended 8 years ago, and that's such an interesting thing because, like, I think even with because Chloe going to Genis, like that's not like a traditional like it's a really good academy. I don't think they ever referenced that in Liberl of like whether like the queens or whatever like go to a very specific school. But I think that's such an interesting thing, knowing that, like I said, the royal family like has a very special tie to the academy in that regard. Also, an interesting little game thing is that anytime there's talk of places ahead of time, it's usually like you are most likely going there. Like I think an old man or something like. Oh, I think was it Old Man Abbott or the guy he's like the old man that sits in the Fred store in Trista. It might have been him. Maybe it was just someone else. Someone references Celdic. There's even Misty. Misty, typically, when she's referencing a place, that's usually an indicator of where you're going to end up next. Usually the story will kind of give you some idea potentially where you might go next, but those are typically key signs of like once locations in Erebonia are kind of referenced. Sometimes, not all the times, but very specific ones. But Misty's usually the go-to of like, yeah, when Misty mentions a place specifically, it's kind of like, there's a good chance you're going there. So I brought it up earlier, the whole Radio Trista Abentime thing. which is kind of neat that that's this little background thing that happens just throughout the games. It's just like certain Sunday nights, Ray will be in his room listening to Radio Trista. So I like that being like a little background thing. Just like, it's kind of cool knowing like, oh, you got like a radio host and it's a whole like segment, and it's just like, it just shows you like the advancement in technology, because you would never expect this world to have something like that, but it does. It's just interesting like where technology is in certain regards, because like there's certain modern day technology we have real world wise that we've had for a while that it's like, oh, this world is just getting to them in certain regards. So I think that's interesting. There's references to like the scarecrow thing, the little thing that you fight during your practical exam. Sara doesn't like using it. In fact, got roped into using it. And at first, I still have to clear my head about that, because I'm like, I feel like at one point I knew the answer, but maybe like later stuff will clarify it for me, because I'm like, I do feel like I know what that might be in reference to, but I'm not sure like who it is that like kind of pushed that on her. I think I know, because I know what those scarecrow things are tied to, what factory it's tied to. So I'm like, who was the one that kind of really pushed that? It has to be, I don't know. I won't speculate until like I know for sure, because I think I know, but I'm not 100% sure. Obviously, like Erebonia being like divided into like provinces, like the Croydon province, for example, because every one of like the 4 great houses like have like their own territories. So like the Croydon province, like I brought up before, is or Duke Alperea. So it's almost like the equivalency to like the 5 regions of that Liberl is divided into. You can almost apply that in this regard with like the provinces by like which duke like controls that respective area. So there were some septium crafts from Liberl that are sold at the Grand Market. There's even Arabic tomatoes. They're surging throughout Zemuria, known in Crossbell, but obviously are native to Liberl, because you learn this because there's actually a request tied to it. Is Ellie's grandfather, the mayor, because I think he's still mayor at this, definitely still mayor at this point in this timeline. He enjoys Mayor McDowell, because I was trying to remember his last name, because I was trying to remember Ellie's last name. But Mayor McDowell, like I said, current Mayor McDowell, loves that. Is that a later? It has, because it definitely has to be like during that, because that's, yeah. So like he likes a certain drink with them. They're very bitter. So I don't remember them being like the big deal that they are kind of outside of it, but it's nice to like tie into like Liberl, like, right, here's some stuff like that gets, exported over here to Erebonia. So that's just kind of a neat little detail. Kind of along those lines, there's like a ZCF light accessory. I think it's the one that helps with blindness. ZCF, the Zeiss Central Factory. So like, nice little, probably something that they actually make there. Maybe that's kind of even more so there. And then also you have Mishi. So it's nice, like little like accessory wise, getting like, little tie-ins to the other games of like, yeah, of course we're going to bring over stuff from like those other countries. That's just how like commerce works and stuff like that, and trade. Because I think even Laura references like, oh, this is Mishi, like, yeah, because it's a Crossbell thing. So like, yeah, but it's more so like an in-game wink and nod to the previous games. If you play them and know of them, like, it's like, oh, because now with the context of the Crossbell games and the Liberl games, I can be like, oh, like, I know that those are references, I know what that is. But like beforehand, that didn't mean as much to me. Now I do, of like, oh, that's like their little wink and nods without fully bringing over like just little touches here and there sprinkled on early in the game to like reference the other countries. So I thought that was kind of neat. An interesting thing, like it makes sense, but I never knew this. Maybe there were line of dialogues in previous games that talked about it, but the church offers treatment free of charge. Granted, you never actually get the benefit from that. It's not like a Dragon Quest game where like you go to like churches to like save and stuff like that, like give your confession, as they say. But it's like, you don't, like, obviously you have your quest where you'll help them, like, get materials for, like, that's a common enough quest, I think, across all the games of, like, helping churches get, materials for like healing items and stuff like that. Because I think there was like an NPC in Celdic who was suffering from something. She like had like bad aches or something like that, and the sister that was there was like, oh yeah, like I'm like the father here is trying to get her whatever she needs to. But it's like, yeah, like even your I think it was a required request, actually, like helping him. It might have actually been a not required. I don't remember. I want to say it was. Father Zerbel. There's even this thing between him getting letters from Archbishop Aemon from Bereahard. What was it? As if expecting... Oh, right. So, for him, it was... I think... It was either him or maybe the archbishop had talked about like the increases in taxes, like they knew it was coming. I think that's what I was trying to reference in my notes, like how it's weird. Like I think maybe Zerbel was saying that Amon almost knew it was coming or something, or maybe it was Zerbel. Like it might have been like Sister Olive. No, Sister Olive is the one that said it. She's the sister that works at the Celtic one church, but she was the one that was saying like, oh, it's almost like they knew this was coming. Because Zerbel was trying to get the Archbishop to speak to Duke Alberea on his behalf, but obviously, as we know, that didn't work out. There's also the talk about, you know, the differences between, like, Liberl and Erebonia, where, like, there's a merchant talking about if, you know, the bracers, or even if not the bracers, at least the army would have handled stuff that like the provisional, like it brought up before, like protects the local area their lord controls. They typically handle like the more small scale stuff, while the army handles bigger stuff. What was it? There was like I said, I think there was another merchant there that was like, is this particular merchant someone you could have run into Bose? Because I think they reference Bose, or they know enough about Liberl to be, they might be from Liberl. So there's an NPC named Luce who's all about honey. And the moment I got introduced to her, I'm like, now that I know about Armorica Village, I'm like you're all about honey. I'm surprised you're not in Armorica Village. She made a reference to Armorica at one point in time. I was like, yeah, I figured as much, because she's like obsessed with honey, even to the point that she was like, when she was a little girl, she wanted to grow up to be a bee. So, leaning a little more into some of the 8-leaf stuff. I do apologize. Like everything's like legitimately scatterbrained and all over, but like I'm just going by what like I took my notes as. This is I don't know if this is only brought up in this one scene, but when Reen is breaking the gate to the national park, he says, you know, 4th form autumn leaf cutter. So I think that's one of the only instances where you get to learn about like what some of his techniques are like amongst the forms. So autumn leaf cutter falls under the 4th form. Like I brought up earlier, I'd only got more of a concrete idea of like the 8 leaves and corrections in my mind recently because of that video and a little bit of research I was doing. So there is some talk about the bracers being all over, but you don't see them in Erebonia anymore because they're still active in like Liberl. I'd assume Calvert. I don't think there's ever any issues in Calvert about it. Like Erebonia, interestingly enough, I guess it's maybe supposed to be like Falcom's like thing of like it's like, yeah, you were mainly a bracer in one. You worked with and even competed against bracers. Well, what I meant by one, it's like the Sky games, Liberl, and then in the Crossbell games, you work with and even, well, at first you're rivals with, but then eventually work with the bracers, and it's like you won't have that option in the Erebonia games to some extent, trying to like get you away from the bracers just because like you had so much run in with them and they wanted to change things up a little bit. Just also it sets Erebonia, another means of setting Erebonia apart from the other places, you know, in that regard. And the final note I thought was interesting is that Elisa is shocked when Reen is like, yeah, I'm from Ymir. And she's like, wait, you're from Ymir? Like, I was like, and now with the context of things, and now like when you look at some of the stuff with Elisa, I'm like, oh, that explains like why you were shocked by like why that even mattered to you. Because you're like, oh, Ymir. Like, okay, once again, like it doesn't mean anything now, but now I think it adds more context for future stuff of like, right, that might be why you acted that certain way when he made that reference. I was like, why? Like, is that such a big deal? Like, it's kind of like, you know, it's like, oh, like, I think at this point it came up about her being from Rower. I think that's about it. Yeah, like at this, I think that came up during the prologue that she was from Rower and stuff like that. But now, but like I said, I have context of like why that might potentially matter to her when she says that. But yeah, final note. That's kind of, you know, the end of this, finally. I've been rambling, and like, I do apologize. This is more all over the place. I'm going to try and... It's still going to be random like that in other future chapters, but like I said, this is just me going down the list of my notes about some of the stuff I wanted to talk about and kind of elaborate a little bit more about. But things are going to be a little more neatly put in order in future chapters. Like I said, 2 going on. I think 3 is where I started really hitting my stride on, like, okay, this is how things are going to go. But I think it's still a little all over the place in 2, but not as much. But I think chapter 3 is where I really kind of got better at, like, how I, like, did my notes for it. So I do apologize. But, yeah. Do keep a lookout for chapter 2's discussion. I haven't even talked about it, but I'm going to be referring to these as EX discussions. That's kind of EX as being like extra is kind of how I've always looked at the terminology like EX. But yeah, these are just going to be like I said, EX deeper dive breakdown discussions. I don't know. We'll see what I end up and at the end of the day decide to do with the titling for these. But that's enough rambling from me. To the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.